about three general categories of approaches to Ajax applications. Now I wanted to take that first category and look at the JavaScript libraries and what some of the distinguishing features of the various libraries are. Oops. And you know, the real issue I'm trying to answer is, look, there's 10 million JavaScript libraries out there. I don't want to learn them all. Just tell me the one I need to learn, and then I'll be done with it. And the simple answer to that is no. I can't tell you the one to learn. There isn't an easy answer to this, but I think there are some criteria that help deciding that. Okay, so first I just wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of recap where this fits in the rich internet application world, and then look at various different categories. You know, which JavaScript libraries are good at these various different things, and then why those various different things might be a reason to choose, you know, jQuery instead of Scriptaculous or EXTJS instead of Prototype. Okay, so first of all, there are a variety of rich internet applications that require a browser plugin. Those are perfectly good applications. Those are an important category of applications, but those are not the same as pure Ajax applications. And I gave the story in the earlier session about driving my motorbike through the remote islands of the Philippines and arriving at an internet cafe and being able to check my Ajax-enabled email with Gmail or Yahoo Mail. And although these categories of application are certainly important and certainly widely used, it's not the same categories of application as what you can do with what everybody already has in their browser today. And that's the bottom category. So that's the topic of this talk. Then there's a number of just traditional web applications where you submit a form, you press submit, you wait around until a page comes back. But we're focusing in this talk on the second category, so no plugin required, pure browser-based application, and one that's Ajax-enabled, that you want to have incremental updates and you want to have asynchronous features where you can keep working while something is happening. And then just kind of to, you know, give my entire morning's talk in 30 seconds, there's three general categories of doing those Ajax-enabled web applications. Category number one is what I want to focus on in this talk. You've already built an application. You've built it in Ruby on Rails, you've built it in PHP, you've built it in Java, you've built it in .NET, and you want to add on to an existing application that's already running. You don't want to start over from scratch. You don't want to throw it away. You don't want to design something new. You want to start to gradually add in Ajax-enabled features. You want to add in some richer controls that regular HTML doesn't have. You want to add in the ability to get incremental updates. You want to add in maybe server-side form validation where you talk to the server and check some information without having to freeze the browser and have everybody wait in the meantime. And that's the category of this talk. But there are two other categories that I mentioned this morning. You may be starting over from scratch, and you might like to integrate Ajax from the very beginning. And some of the frameworks that have integrated Ajax support are really a lot simpler. So in JSF2 or in Struts2 or in ASP.NET Ajax, you don't have to write a lot of, hardly any, sometimes none, explicit JavaScript code. That's a big advantage to some people. And your Ajax requests know about the names of all of your server-side objects. And so in JSF2, you can refer to your customer lookup service by name, the same names you use in all the rest of your logic. So although we're going to talk about this first category, I don't want to imply that it's the only category of application or necessarily the best category of application, but it's a very important category of application. And then I talked about GWT as a third category of application this morning, just briefly, which is trying to mimic a desktop application. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today. Today I'm talking about you've got an existing web application. You want to gradually add in rich components and Ajax-enabled features. So you want a JavaScript library. Which one do you choose? And the answer, of course, is it depends. There's no easy answer to this, but it depends on what. And I wanted to mention some of the criteria that people use to decide among the various different JavaScript libraries. So one of the obvious choices is how well does it help you simplify Ajax? Because normal Ajax is kind of a pain in the neck. You've got to make an anonymous function where you capture the request object inside this funny closure. And you know, Java programmers have no idea what they're talking about when you do this stuff. Because Java programmers don't have any idea about passing functions around and making closures, and especially making an anonymous function that captures a local variable. It's just beyond beyond the understanding of a normal Java programmer. So you'd like to simplify that stuff and not have to do all this kind of low-level hacking. Then there's just the category of rich controls. HTML is kind of weak. And I mentioned this morning I was reading a Flash and Flex book, and the author of this book was mocking Ajax developers for calling their applications rich internet applications. And his point was, hey, Ajax developers ought to call their applications less poor internet applications. And I think there's some truth to that. That even when you soup it up and you kind of make these libraries, it's not really all that great. And one of the examples I want to give is Google Maps. Oops. Notice this is a traditional web application with getting a whole new page here. And normal HTML doesn't have a slider. There's no slider in HTML. And the people who made Google Maps are so happy with this slider. And they're so, proud of this slider. Now, I personally think this slider is cheesy, an American expression for kind of not really kind of corny and not really so great. But they're so proud of this. Why are they proud of a slider? They're proud of a slider because sliders are not part of ordinary HTML. So a second category of reasons for choosing a JavaScript library is it has a lot of rich controls in it. A third reason is, well, a lot of what you do in JavaScript programming is searching around in the HTML page to find things of interest and modifying them. So searching the DOM and manipulating the DOM. And so which libraries are good at that? That's another category. And you can already see where I'm heading, which is the answer for which is good at each of these different bullets is different in almost every case. It'd be nice if you say, oh, the best one for Ajax is jQuery, the best one for Rich is jQuery, the best one for this is, oh, jQuery is the library I want. But unfortunately, we'll see that which is best in these various different categories tends to be different libraries. There tends not to be one clear winner across the board. Then I think that there's, ease of use is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. What's easy for somebody is hard for somebody else. A Lisp programmer comes to JavaScript, or an ML programmer, or a Groovy programmer, and they say, oh, yeah, first-class functions, that makes perfectly good sense. I understand all that. And a Java programmer or a C# programmer comes and says, what the heck are these first-class functions? I don't understand it. But I still think that there's a relatively objective way of measuring which of the JavaScript libraries are simple to use and which are complicated. Some have 18 steps to do things, and some have 2 or 3 steps to do things. And one of the points I want to make for bullet number 4 is there's a big loser in this category. There's a clear last place choice for which is simplest. Then JavaScript is a small language. It's not like Java that's got 18 million libraries in it, so it's a pretty small language. So one of the things that JavaScript libraries do is make the language bigger. Add in more features. Add in the ability to make real hash tables. Add in new data structures. Add in new ways of doing first-class functions and doing currying and making it easier to do closures and making wraps around functions and extending arrays and adding new sorting algorithms and so on. Then there's a number of features which might not matter for small projects, but matter a lot for projects that really have high usage, like Gmail or Yahoo Mail. And so I want to talk about some of those things. And finally, there's just the issue of which one is going to win. I don't want to spend 18 weeks studying some JavaScript library when the week after that, all the developers on the open source project decide, well, this was fun, but I got a new job offer, and I'm moving off to Tahiti, and I'm not going to support this anymore, and it's dead. So this is not the only thing that matters. We don't have to jump on the bandwagon all the time, but it matters which of the libraries are popular, because the ones that are popular and are growing in popularity tend to have more developers and tend to have more support in the community and tend to keep growing. Okay, so let's go through these one at a time. And so when you do Ajax, there's two kind of ways of doing it. One way of doing it is you send off a query, your JavaScript sends off a query to the server, you get a piece of raw data back, usually in JSON, but it might be, Scott is giving a talk on JSON on Friday, but sometimes in another format, maybe in XML, maybe it's some custom format. JSON is the most common format. And then you grab the data when it arrives on the client, you examine the data, and you build some HTML out of it, and then you stick the HTML into the page. And that sometimes is known as data-centric Ajax. And if you kind of look at these one-liners, it's about the same. If you take any of the popular libraries, it's super ridiculously simple to fire off a request to the server and get some data back. And so let me just mention what you would do in jQuery, but it's almost the same in the other libraries. So this says $.Ajax is the name of the function here. This says, go to this relative URL, take the data that comes back, and pass the text of the data that comes back to this function. And then this function decides what to do with it. So it's pretty simple, and it's about the same in all the other libraries. But it's not so simple in raw JavaScript. In raw JavaScript, you've got to look up the XML HTTP request object, and then you've got to wrap it up in this funny anonymous function where you make a copy of it and you put in you make a function on the fly and you close it. Nobody understands how to do that. And the funny thing is, I have probably the 10 of the 12 most popular books on Ajax that have ever been written. I just go to Amazon.com, I type in Ajax, I look at the popular ones, and I just order them all. And I take them, to my office and I read them. And if you take the 12 most popular books on Ajax, well, I have 10 of them. 2 of them, for some reason, I didn't order. 8 of them say, this business about making an anonymous function and capturing the XML HTTP request, this is too complicated. Let's just take the request object and make it a global variable. And then when the request handler comes along and reads it, it'll just read it out of the global variable. And this is so bogus that it would make you cry if it didn't make you laugh. Because the A in Ajax is supposed to stand for asynchronous. And that part of the acronym, the X is usually not accurate, but that part of the acronym is accurate. And if you read it out of a global variable, then if I press a push button, and it takes 2 seconds to get the request, and before the end user gets the request back 2 seconds later, the user presses another push button, it overwrites the global variable. This is such a bad mistake, it's hard to even imagine that anybody with any experience of more than 2 months in Ajax programming would do it. So why do 8 of the 12 most popular books in the world on Ajax make that mistake? The answer is they're written by Java programmers. And Java programmers don't know what functional programming is, which, by the way, is one of my sermons I give to computer science educators, that it's important to learn more than one style of programming. Object-oriented programming is an important style, but it's not the only important style. So is functional programming. So anyway, these hide all those details and they make it very simple, but they're about the same. And another style of Ajax is content-centric Ajax. The HTML is built on the server, not on the client, and the server just sends a little chunk of HTML over. And this is not bad. Hotels.com does that for the drop-down list. They just send back a bulleted list of the auto-completions, and then CSS formats it to look like a drop-down box. There's nothing wrong with building HTML on the server. In fact, it's better if you only use the data in one place. If you use the same data in 5 different pages in 5 different places, data-centric is better. So sending a little small chunk of HTML is not a bad thing, and many popular real-life applications do this. And there's a lot of shortcuts. So here's jQuery. So let me just summarize how you do this in jQuery. jQuery says, go to this address on the server and take the HTML that comes back and insert it into the current page in the place that has this ID. Pretty simple. Behind the scenes, it's doing something much more complicated, but it's pretty simple. But all of them almost, now Dojo actually doesn't support this directly, surprisingly, have this direct support. And so the conclusion is Ajax support is not a criteria that will help you make up your mind which JavaScript library is better, because they're all about the same. Because it's not really all that hard to do the fundamental requests. And yeah, the prototype people say, no, but we've got this one extra feature, and the EXTJS people, no, we've got this one extra feature. But really, they're all about the same. It's not really that different. And just, if you look at the code, they're one-liners. Okay, Dojo, it's not a one-liner, it's a five-liner, because they didn't build that in, surprisingly. But that's not an important lack. And so Ajax support is not a way of deciding which JavaScript library to use. All the popular ones have good enough Ajax support for what you'll need. All right, Marty, well, that didn't help me much. And that's kind of the point. Don't look at the Ajax support of the libraries as a way of deciding among them. They're all pretty good. Now, again, I'm really emphasizing the general JavaScript libraries. There are a number of libraries like GWT or DWR or JSON RPC where you sacrifice some loose coupling in order to gain some productivity, and some people think it's a worthwhile trade-off and some people don't. So in all of these examples, this is just a random URL. This is prototype. Prototype doesn't know if this server-side application is written in Java or is written in .NET or is written in PHP or is written in Ruby on Rails. It doesn't know and it doesn't care. There are a number of applications where you care. So for instance, in JSON RPC or in GWT, you actually call to the specific Java function name on the server. And you pass individual arguments and you get a return value rather than passing a query string that is going to have to be parsed and decoded. That's a lot easier, but it also causes tight coupling. You now are tied to the specific implementation on the server, and sometimes that trade-off is worth it and sometimes it's not. But in the general JavaScript libraries, the support for Ajax is about a tie. Okay, then there's a number of applications where what you really care about is not Ajax. Ajax isn't that hard, the basic functionality. What you care about are rich, or some people say richer, controls than normally HTML. And there, I think there's some clear winners. Of the main popular libraries, EXTJS, Dojo, and YUI are clearly superior to, say, Prototype, Scriptaculous, and jQuery. Prototype, Scriptaculous, and jQuery have a small set of extended controls. EXTJS, Dojo, YUI have a large, rich, very large set of controls. And so if you want, pie charts, EXTJS gives them to you, jQuery doesn't. And jQuery just gives you, a few small ones. And so if what you really care is lots of fancy trees that you can expand and contract, tables that have, sorting built in, all sorts of fancy sliders, charts, graphs, then one of these three libraries is what you're going to want. And jQuery is, I'm being polite a little bit by putting the word little in here. jQuery is lagging quite a bit compared to the others. It has a much smaller, dramatically smaller, a fifth of the size compared to these top libraries. And Prototype and Scriptaculous are so far behind. Prototype doesn't have any controls at all. It's really just a JavaScript library. And Scriptaculous is really about visual effects, not about controls. It has a few small controls. So if what you really care about is the controls, these three libraries should be at the top of your list. A lot of what I do when I'm doing an Ajax applications is searching around in the DOM, finding my text fields, seeing if they're empty, running some sort of validation algorithm that I probably get from a third party, and then lighting them up with red markers and saying, you dummy, you didn't fill this in, if it's blank. So I'm searching around in the DOM a lot, and I'm manipulating the DOM. I'm turning the background of cells red. I'm drawing borders around things. I'm deleting elements. I'm lighting up elements that were previously hidden. I'm lighting up a little spinner that says that I'm working, and then I turn it back off again when the result comes back, and so on. And there, I think jQuery is a big winner. jQuery is just, that's what they did at the beginning. And jQuery had, two really brilliant ideas at the beginning. Brilliant idea number one jQuery had was, don't invent a new way of searching around in the DOM. And please, don't use the XML DOM library. It's so low level, it's too tedious to use. But they didn't try to invent something new. They said, well, web developers already know how to use CSS. And we normally think of CSS as kind of a way of marking up the page. But the first thing CSS is a way of searching the page. And you write a pattern that matches certain elements, and then you apply the whatever coloring or fonts or whatever to that pattern. And so they said, well, web developers already know how to use CSS. Let's just use CSS as the mechanism for searching for elements that match. And so when I got to jQuery, I saw a million things that I said, oh, that's not part of CSS. That's something they added in. And then I went to CSS3, and it was actually part of CSS3 to my great amazement. So when I started doing jQuery programming, I learned how little I actually knew about CSS. And so the first thing you do is you say $, and in the $, you put double quotes, and you put a CSS pattern. Find all the DOM elements in the page that match the CSS pattern. So that was brilliant idea number one. Brilliant idea number two that jQuery had is this idea of chaining. And so they said, every time you apply a function, so this toggle class says, find all the things that match this, and then apply this function to each of them. So this is really returns an array or a set, and this is calling this method over and over again on each element in the array. But when it's done, this method returns the original array. So now you can chain them all together. You can say, search for all H3 elements of a certain style, then turn them red, and then put another dot on the end, then make them bigger, dot, and then make their background color yellow. And so you can chain these arguments together one after the other. Java made a fundamental mistake when they designed Java beans. And maybe they had no choice back then, there weren't generics, but still, in today's world, it's a deficiency. So those of you who are Java programmers, when you write a setter method, set first name, what does it return? Void. It doesn't return anything. What should it have returned? Say it again. Old value, that you can make an argument for that. Some people make an argument for returning a Boolean, but there's a much more valuable thing that it could have and should have returned. This. It should have returned the original object. Then you could have said customer dot set first name dot set last name dot set address dot set zip code, and chain it together. And that's what jQuery does. It's too late to do that in Java now. It's, we're stuck with the original Java beans convention, and they had some reasons for doing that, but it would have been better if they could have had it return the original object. They didn't, but jQuery does. So it's very convenient, and that's really what made jQuery famous and popular in the first place. However, everybody else is stealing it. And in fact, surprisingly, John Resig of jQuery is actually encouraging other people to steal it. Amazingly, he's a pretty open-minded sort of guy. And so John Resig in particular and the jQuery team in general has spun off their DOM manipulation library as a separate open source project called Sizzle with super liberal licensing. Basically, anybody can take it and do anything they want with it without acknowledging jQuery and without paying them a dime. And so John Resig is obviously not motivated by money or fame in doing this. And so everybody else is stealing it. And so EXTJS and Dojo now have stolen the basic idea of doing CSS-based DOM querying, and it's now part of those libraries too. And so they've rapidly, catching up to jQuery in that realm. And so it's not, even though this is the clear winner, these guys are rapidly, beating on their footsteps behind them. Okay, then there's just a question of which one is easier. And, I think that there's a moderately clear winner and there's a very clear loser here. The moderately clear winner is jQuery. And so let me give you two examples. Even if you've never seen jQuery before, you can probably follow Okay, so this line right here says, find all of the table rows in the entire web page. And then find if it's the even child of its parent. And for a TR element, its parent is always table. So this is really saying, find the even table rows. You got table one, row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4. Find the even ones. And then turn them gray. So in one line, I've said, find all the HTML tables, find the table rows, find the even ones, and change and apply this CSS style, which I've named to indicate that it's going to turn the background gray. So I've grayed out every other table row, which is a common thing that people want to do, so that the table rows are more readable from a distance. And that's just a one-liner. This is a CSS match. This is actually something you can do in regular CSS, and then this is a jQuery function that says, add in this CSS element if it wasn't already there. If it was already there, turn it back off again. Okay, this one's a little bit trickier, but it still uses normal CSS syntax. And I didn't believe that when I first saw it. I thought it was all sorts of jQuery extensions. But this pound sign, those of you who know CSS, pound sign means an ID, right? So find the ID called form1. Then look for a TD that's inside of it. Then look for an input element with a CSS class name called required. One of the tricks you often do in all of these libraries is you use CSS class names for something they were never intended for. Markers for your JavaScript code, not for real CSS formatting. Then see if it has a value attribute that's empty. And believe it or not, that all of this is standard CSS3. And so this just says, well, when I wrote this form, if any of the text fields are not allowed to be empty, I'll assign it a CSS class name of required. And remember, you're allowed to have as many CSS class names as you want, so it doesn't prevent you from having other CSS class names. And so in this one line, I'm saying, find all of the text fields that I marked as required, but that are not filled in. Find the enclosing element, which is a little table cell that I've put it in. Mark it with this element, so that later on I can light up this message. And then add this CSS class name, which is going to put the red around it. So I've left out a little bit of this code. You haven't seen all these other functions. But basically, in one line, I've said, find all the text fields that are not allowed to be empty, that are empty, and light them up with a warning box. So that's a clear winner. There's also a clear loser. Google Closure is dramatically harder to use, in my opinion, and almost everybody else's opinion, than all the other libraries. And YUI is probably second behind that in terms of least easy to use. Now, least easy to use is not always a bad thing. Maybe the extra effort up front is worth it. And Google Closure is really aimed at the extra big projects, where a lot of upfront effort to avoid typing and type problems and so on is worth it. So Google Closure has all sorts of fancy features where you can mark in comments types. JavaScript doesn't have types. And then when it compiles all this JavaScript and mashes it all together, it'll actually check all those types. And so it has a lot of support for things that JavaScript doesn't have, but boy, is it painful to use. And there's all sorts of, you load this and you load that, and you require this and you require that, and so on. However, although Google Closure is not as simple to use as jQuery, it's massively bigger than jQuery, and it has a lot more in it. And Google Closure has an unbelievably large set of things. It has a moderately large set of GUI controls, but it has a huge set of just programming features. And the really great thing about Google Closure is that at runtime, your JavaScript only contains the features that you need. So at the very end, after you've built your project, you run it through a compiler. And your compiler does this really complicated dependency analysis to figure out which of the features, the 10 million features of this gigantic JavaScript library, your application is actually using. And only the features that it's actually using are compiled in. So the fact that it has some fancy, rotatable AVL tree, if there is such a thing, in the library doesn't mean you pay that download time if you're not using it. And so it has just it just quintuples, increases by a factor of 5, the size of JavaScript and the number of functions and data structures and utilities that it has. It's massive. I mean, just their part on math utilities is, bigger than the documentation for Scriptaculous. It's amazing. And the good news is you don't pay that download time if you don't use those features, but they're there if you want them. I don't work for Google. I'm not a Google employee. I was just wearing this because I mentioned GWT this morning. Just one of my friends gave it to me. But a number of my friends who work at Google told me that they even have a secret library that only the people inside of Google have access to, and that Google Closure is actually even bigger than the massive library that they've released publicly. But the public Google Closure library, this is totally different than GWT. This is just a pure JavaScript library. And Gmail, Google Maps, and Google Docs are all built on Google Closure. So this is a library that has proved itself in real life as able to build real-world applications. That there's even more internal stuff. Prototype of the kind of more normal-sized libraries is probably the second place winner, but a far second to Google Closure. And so Prototype, more than jQuery, XTJS, Dojo, or Scriptaculous, is about extending the JavaScript language itself and adding in new features. Especially, if you gave me the rich controls of EXTJS, you gave me the DOM manipulation of jQuery, and all I want are 2 functions from Prototype. Give me curry and give me wrap, and I would be happy. And map, 3. I want 3. I'd be happy. And so I really like the features that Prototype adds for just extending the JavaScript language, and I think they're much better than those that jQuery or EXTJS has. And jQuery is quite a bit back there. So this is a problem. The winners and losers kind of scattered all over the board, and there's not one library that's good DOM manipulation, good GUI controls, good JavaScript general programming, easy to use, all in one package. And so I think the point here is there's not one right answer. There isn't one right JavaScript library. You need to look at your application and say, which is most important for me in this application? And then say, okay, GUI controls are the most important thing for me in this application. Okay, I want EXTJS, Dojo, or YUI. No, this is a really big application. I want to have a lot of complicated data structures. Google Closure is really what I care about. No, this is not a very big application. I'm going to do some Ajax requests, but I'm going to do some DOM manipulation. I want it fast and easy. I want high productivity. It's not a huge project. I've only got 4 or 5 pages. It's only 5 developers on my team. jQuery is a good choice. Okay, and sometimes you're going to build a project, and from the beginning it's going to be big. If this succeeds, it will be big. And Google Closure has features that none of the other libraries have for extra large projects. So you can put in comments, oh, the first argument to this function is supposed to be a number. The second argument to this function is supposed to be a string. I mean, JavaScript, not only does it not check that your types are right, it doesn't even check that the number of arguments are right. In JavaScript, Java programmers just blows their mind that this is possible in a programming language. You can write a function that you write it with one argument. You say function square parentheses x. And then you can call it with 2 arguments. And if you don't use that second argument, it's just ignored. And you can use it anyway by using this arguments array. Or you can look up 2 arguments, but then call it with no arguments. It's just baffling. And so Google Closure lets you put in a lot of those checks in, and then they run a compiler, and it checks all that. And if you declare this function to take 1 argument, and there's any place in your code ever where you call it with 2 arguments, it'll tell you at compile time, the time it matches all the JavaScript together into one big optimized file. Also, their compiler does more than just mashing it together into one big file. It does all sorts of optimizations. It does runtime optimization. It does things like loop unrolling. It does math. If you say 3 times 4 times x, it'll pre-multiply the 3 times 4, so it's only doing 1 multiplication at runtime, and so on. It has a way of building online documentation copied more or less from Java's JavaDoc. It has a built-in unit tester. It has performance metering. It has the small file it builds is dramatically smaller than most of the other kind of JavaScript compressors or minifiers out there. So this is the big winner. And these two, especially YUI, I think are in second place. And so what's good for a big project is not necessarily what's good for a small project. And then last, I think there's a feature that really matters, which is who's going to win. And in the internet world, you never know who's going to win for sure, but you can get some indication. And one of the ways to get indication is sites that are deployed right now today using these various libraries. And so there are sites that try to go around and measure. How many sites deployed now run Prototype? How many sites that are deployed now run jQuery? But if you just count the number of sites, it's a little misleading, because a small site that one guy did in his backyard as a sample project for his undergraduate CS 101 class shouldn't be counted the same as Gmail that millions of people use. So then people try to weight the sites based on the number of people use them and so on. It's kind of becomes difficult. Another way to measure, which is easier for you and I to just do off the cuff, is to look at job postings that contain certain keywords. And you can get false positives. Like it's practically impossible to measure prototype, because there's too many uses of the word prototype that don't really mean the prototype JavaScript library. And if you measure Ajax, maybe somebody's advertising a janitorial service in Sri Lanka where they're going to scrub the floors with Ajax cleaning powder. But they give you rough trends, especially when there are words like jQuery that are unlikely to have false positives. So jQuery, how many postings in the past 5 years have contained the word jQuery somewhere in the job posting anywhere? What about Dojo, EXTJS, YUI, GWT? And although you should take all these numbers with a grain of salt, I think this trend is clear. jQuery, boom, has really dramatically risen in popularity compared to all of the other libraries. And I think this is an important consideration. It's not the only important consideration, but it's an important consideration that it's not going to go away because so many people are behind it, and there's a lot of developers available because so many people use it. And sure, everybody's going to keep copying it, but yeah, a lot of people working on the project and using it, so it'll also continue to improve and get better and be well tested. And everybody else is kind of more or less a tie. And EXTJS, sometimes there's a space, sometimes there's a dash, so this line is probably too low. So basically all the others are roughly tied, and jQuery is the winner. Okay, so the basic bottom line of this entire talk is you're going to go out of it more confused than you came in. That there is no simple answer to which JavaScript library is best. And if somebody tells you that there's a simple answer, they're just plain flat out wrong. And there's an answer to which is best in various different categories. But you're going to use probably multiple of these categories on your projects, and so the key is to evaluate which of these criteria, which of these factors is most important to your project, and that'll help you decide. Okay, that's all I have. Why don't I have 5 minutes, so why don't I take a couple of public questions, and then I'll have plenty of time after this for questions up front. A couple of public questions before we break? Yes, sir. Can you mix these libraries together? Okay. So the question is, how hard is it to mix multiple of these libraries? My answer is it's moderately hard. For instance, jQuery and Prototype both use the $sign function. Now, jQuery has a way of getting around that. And you can run this function called deconflict and then not use it. But if you already wrote it in jQuery, you probably use the $sign because it was so convenient. And now you drop in a bunch of Prototype code. They're both using the same function. Whichever one you load second overwrites the first one. And the ones that have rich GUIs have an elaborate CSS scheme for styling all those GUIs. And so if you try to mix EXTJS and Dojo together, you have trouble getting your CSS styles to match. So I think the bottom line is it's not very easy to mix them. Most people choose just one. Why don't I take one more public question, and then I'll take as many as I want up front. Yes, sir.
Is there any reliable way where I can merge multiple, say I'm using different effects of jQuery or any JavaScript library, where I have to include multiple JS files? So I want to merge them in one JS file so there is only one request going to the server.
So the question is, if I have multiple JavaScript files, is there a way of mashing them together into one file so that there's less download time, there's not 2 HTTP requests, there's just one? And the answer is yes. The Google Closure compiler will do this for you, and you can use the Google Closure compiler even if you're not using the Google Closure library.
Okay.
So you can use the Google Closure library on other JavaScript code, and it will mash your JavaScript files together and shrink them down dramatically. And so the Google Closure compiler is used by lots of people who aren't using the Google Closure library.
Thank you.
OK, any other questions I'll take up front? Thanks very much.